community. Um, it's because you entered this community since Dan left, and now he's returning to offer his wisdom today. But so, Dan, I thank you for being here. Thank you for saying yes. I do apologize for having to leave. I can't believe that that happened, but life happens, right? Life happens,
It
and we
does.
adjust. That's what we do. And so I'm so glad you're here, and take it away, Dan.
Yeah, thank you, thank you, thank you for having me here. It's how cool is this to be back and see all these faces and be here in Florida and all of you there in New Jersey, and we all get to be here at the same time. That's super fun. I'm just soaking in all the faces, and Ty, the hat changes are impeccable. And how good it is to hear the music again. So we have such a unique musical voice in this community. It's pretty amazing. So really nice to be back hearing and be back here with you all. I thought I would share before we really start. I thought I would share a quote that seemed to come up back in practitioner studies. It came up over and over and over and over again, and it kind of led me in the direction of this talk. So I thought I would share it first, so we can kind of have it percolating in the back of our minds. And this quote is, "The thing then works for us by working through us and is us always. It cannot work for us in any other way. It spreads itself over the whole universe and shouts at us from every angle, but it can become power to us only when we recognize it as power." And so I am quite certain that you have probably heard this quote before, but it came up all the time. And so when I sat down to ponder and meditate on what message to bring today, that was the first thing that came up. And I almost wanted to, like, well, I don't know, that comes up all the time. But it just kept poking and poking, and I thought, all right, well, we'll go there, we'll see what happens. And so that kind of became the impetus for this message. So let that kind of ruminate a little bit. Don't spend too much time or attention on it at this moment. We'll come back to it, but just let that kind of in the background seep in those words. So when I first, this is back in like 2008, maybe, when I first started coming around to CSLNJ, was asked to come and sub on the drums in the band here and there for a while, and then more frequently. But the message that I kept hearing all the time was the shift. There's a shift happening in the world. There's this shift happening. And it was never described anything more than there's this shift. But everybody talked about it. It was talked about all the time. It came up pretty much every week, whether it was in the message or it was in conversation before and after. Everybody was talking about this shift. At first, I had no idea what it meant. I was, had no idea. I was like, what is this shift? What shift? And then as it kind of started to sink in what that meant, oh, that's really cool. There is this shift happening. There's this thing happening in the world behind the scenes, right? And this was like almost 15 years ago that we were talking about this. And the image that was left in my mind, the image that I created about this shift was this idea that magically one day enough people will have made this shift that will wake up, and the world is going to be like white light and flowers and butterflies, and everything's going to be fantastic. Like it's some utopia, right? And I was like, oh man, that's going to be great. And then at some point, the conversation around this shift just kind of faded away. It stopped coming up in conversations. It stopped being talked about. And I thought about this a couple of weeks ago and went, I wonder what happened to that conversation. And so I started looking back on it and realized that idea had actually stuck with me so strongly. I had actually been following this shift the whole time without really realizing it. And so I really held on to that the what if of that shift. What if that were possible? What if that was something that we could actually create? What if science of mind was the way to have that shift into this utopia, white light, woo-woo kind of flowers and butterflies kind of life? And so what I have learned along the way is a lot of things, but two primary things. The first, that if we were to make this shift would somehow require that everyone's thoughts, everyone in the world, that all of their thoughts somehow immediately change in exactly the same way to the exact same new idea, the exact same new thought, in order to create this shift, this new way. That seems kind of unlikely that everyone in the world would have the same exact thought change at the same exact time, that all of a sudden we would just create this new reality. Because what we know is that there is not this, as Reverend Michelle was talking about, there is not this God figure out there in the clouds, but it really is life through us, as us, that we are of and from, that the world creates from. And so it really would take every single person to change all of that thought at the same time, to have this kind of white light utopia, the picture that I had painted for myself so long ago. And so the second thing I realized is more likely that there is actually a process in which this shifting of thought gradually unfolds. That it's not an immediate change, but that there is this unfolding of healing and changing of thought and changing of belief. And so, for whatever reason, my mind obviously makes the jump from that to the subjective mind, right? In the universe, there is this filter, this container of memory. It is the gatekeeper of thought. So the subjective mind is this aspect of God, of the universe, that plays a lot of different roles. It is the creative law. It is the thing that, when thought is had, thought passes through that law and creates into form. But it is also the memory keeper, the storage, the history of existence. And so every thought, every person, every point of consciousness remains intact timelessly in this subjective mind. This is also, we call this soul. And so this plays out. There is the universal soul, which is that history, that gatekeeper, that universal memory of life. And then there's the individualized soul, which is really not actually separated from that, but we like to pretend it is for whatever reason. And so that individualized soul is that place within us where we feel that connection, is that thing within us that pulls us towards whatever it is that is ours to do. It pulls us in the direction of creation. It pulls us in the direction of expressing more life, more good, more of this God experience. And so we have that individualized part in us, because, again, not that we are actually separate from, but because we come here with these agreements that we are solid beings, that the things we touch and stand on and feel, that all of this form is solid. We have this agreement that we are this individualized expression of the one. And so that individualized soul is that thing that resides within us, that continues encouraging us and calling us and poking us and pulling us. And so that becomes really important when we recognize that this shift, the language of the conversation of the shift may have changed, but the shift itself has not actually gone away. And in reality, the shift was never anything new. It was new to me. It was new to the way we were talking about it, perhaps. But the shift is really just life expressing. Life itself just continuously moving and expressing and creating. So when we see this, it's the connection between the process that is unfolding and the subjective mind, or the soul of the universe, we begin to realize just that much more the perfection, the intelligence that is at play behind all of life. Because of what we know that thought passes through law, law creates in form. And so every thought always creates, but it creates based on the filter of the subjective mind. It creates based on the sum total of our beliefs, of unconscious beliefs, the collective conscious beliefs. And so that is what shows up in front of us. What shows up in front of us is the world based on how we as a collective believe about the world. And so when something shows up, it is through that subjective mind that thing shows up. That shows up exactly perfectly based on how it is that we as a collective or as an individual perceive that thought, that thing. And so we very easily get caught up in trying to make sense of things, make sense of the way that these things show up. And it's from our perspective. We try and fill in all of these gaps, right? Our minds don't like the ambiguity. We don't like not knowing. So we try and fill in all of these spaces when the things show up, particularly when they show up in ways that we don't like or don't understand. We want to fill in that gap to make it make sense. And so we really get to make whatever context we want. We get to make up whatever the context of the story for how that thing is showing up in front of us. We have this freedom, free will to honestly, to create limiting stories that keep us stuck in trying to figure that thing out. But here is the thing about that. So often we think that we know better. This is usually not a conscious thing. It's usually not intentional, but we have expectations. We have expectations on how things should show up, how we want the things to show up. I had expectations about what this shift would look like. And certainly by now, it should have all been white light and, all that good stuff, right? So trying to make sense of how that shift showed up, not in the way that I thought it did. I get to create this context around this that goes, well, this certainly isn't that. What the hell happened? How did, what is going on? And so it brings me to another quote. This is not an Ernest Holmes quote, but this is another one that I like to use because it shows so clearly in so many different contexts just how backwards we tend to have this, our perception, just how backwards we tend to create the context around these stories. So this quote is actually from the movie Bruce Almighty. It is the one where he is tasked with creating the modern day ark in the middle of like Washington, DC, and everyone thinks he's crazy, right? So he's talking to God and not understanding why things are showing up the way they are, why he's being tasked with this, what's going on. And so God says to him, now we have to realize the context of this is the very, Judeo-Christian God in the sky thing. So we'll take that for what it is with a grain of salt, but the importance of this is still clear. So God says, let me ask you something. If someone prays for patience, you think God gives them patience, or does God give them the opportunity to be patient? If they prayed for courage, does God give them courage, or does he give them the opportunity to be courageous? If someone prayed for the family to be closer, do you think God zaps them with warm, fuzzy feelings, or do you think God gives them opportunities to love each other? So it just totally flips around the whole, like, yeah, let's pray to this thing out there and it's going to give us patience. No, if we are going to focus on patience, we're going to be surrounded with opportunities to practice being patient. If we are praying for courage, and very easy to do, right? In this old model of God out there, it's really easy to pray to this Santa Claus kind of thing and hopefully get back that thing we're asking for. But no, we're not going to get the courage. We're going to get situations all around us to be courageous. So if we pray for or think there's going to be this shift, are we going to get a shift of warm white light and butterflies and roses and all the things? No, we're going to get all of the situations to practice this shift, to practice being the shift. And so this new way, like that quote we said earlier, this new way is shouting at us from every angle. The thing then in itself shouts at us from every angle. And so it is time that as a collective, we begin listening to that shouting, but we have to listen differently. We have to listen from this perspective, this kind of flipped around way of listening that recognizes, the shift didn't go away. The language might have changed, but the shift actually intensified. The shift has been in our face so much stronger exponentially. I mean, it's like, if the shift was here, then it's here now. It is giant. It's everywhere. It's in our face. And the crazy thing is so much of the collective society looks at this in language of wanting to go back to normal. Wait a minute. Now we're trying to shift. We wanted, this is literally what we asked for. It's not fun. it's not fun. This is not great. This is not warm and fuzzies, but this is what we have asked for, prayed for, sought after, because this, what we are looking at over the last, I don't even know what time frame to put on it. Year, 2 years, 4 years, 10 years, whatever time frame, 250 years, whatever time frame we want to put on this. This is the shift we've been looking at, that we're actually chemicalizing generations worth of unconscious, subconscious collective thought, that we are witnessing the chemicalization, the coming to the surface of all of the beliefs that if we really want this shift of a world where everyone's needs are met, where everyone is equal, where everything shows up to support everybody with equality and equity, we have to look at all these other things that have never been looked at in the existence of this country, of the entire Western world. I mean, there are things that have been since the beginning of time and since the beginning of written history that we are the first ones to be looking at extensively. And so it is showing up in our face. Chemicalization. That is the one of the number one things in science of mind. This is old school science of mind. Chemicalization. That is exactly what's showing up. And so really what's happening, what's showing up in front of us looks so uncomfortable, and yet we're witnessing the evolution of human awareness. That as people, as a collective, that our awareness is shifting to this point where the things that were once, I hesitate to use the word accepted, they certainly were not acceptable, but were commonly accepted in society. Those things are now not acceptable. Those things are now realized as no way. That doesn't continue here. And so as the universe continues to shout at us from every angle, we begin to realize, or maybe remember, that life is creative, always moving toward a greater expression of life. Never less, never a lesser expression, but always a greater expression. And so to believe what we say we believe, we have to recognize then that we've kind of had this backward perspective on things, that even science of mind is looking to evolve. The principles are universal, but how we practice it, how we apply it, how we look at it, all of that now changes, right? There is no normal to go back to. We are looking at a new way of being. And so in a new way of being, we can't repeat the old ways of doing. We have to have a new way of doing. And so the principles are the same, but the way we apply these principles, the way we look at life, the way we recognize life showing up, basically, we can't resist the thing in front of us anymore and say, I believe in oneness. We have to look at the thing that's in front of us, the world that's in front of us, and going, oh yeah, this is exactly what we asked for. This is exactly what we asked to happen. Maybe we didn't know it would show up this way, but we recognize that moving and only moving through what shows up in front of us is how we move into this new way of being. It's the only way, by having this flipped around, this flipped over or upside down perspective. Or maybe it's the right side up perspective. Maybe we had it backwards before. I don't know. Having this new, whatever, different perspective, flipped over perspective, really that's the only way that we get to no longer resist the thing that's showing up in front of us. And we actually get to work with the flow of life, with spirit, with each other. We get to be this collective wholeness, right? Wholeness is a massive principle within oneness. We can't actually have oneness if we don't have wholeness. Wholeness meaning not we're perfect and whole, and that's great. It's also a major bypass at times. Wholeness, the idea that everything that exists is part of the whole. And if the only thing that exists is, if there's an infinite, there can only be one infinite, we can't have two, so everything has to be part of the infinite. Everything that exists has to be part of this whole. It has to be part of this one. Every moment of our life has to be part of this whole. And so when we flip it over and look at it from the perspective of what is showing up here that is looking to change, what is showing up here that is looking to shift, how do we become the shift? Then all of a sudden, there is a whole new experience for us. And so let's read this quote again. The thing then works for us by working through us and is us always. It cannot work for us in any other way. It spreads itself over the whole universe and shouts at us from every angle, but it can become power to us only when we recognize it as power. And so I had no idea years ago that this quote, this phrase, these couple of phrases would have that much power in them to recognize this entire decade plus long shift conversation, that the thing then working through us and is us always, right? The thing, it's one, there's oneness and it's wholeness. It can't be anything else. It's everywhere and literally shouting at us to listen, to see, to observe, to work with, to look at what's showing up in front of us. It's spreading itself all over all of that because it is all of that. So not only is God the thing that is, I guess I'll say beyond, because we don't really have a word to aptly describe this consciousness that is not of time and space. And yet time and space, this world that we live in, is part of the whole. So not only is it that thing that's beyond time and space, it is the time and space, but it's also energizing and animating and living in and moving and breathing the time and space. But none of this seems true until we recognize it. So when we don't recognize it, it's like the exact opposite. It seems like there's nothing here. It seems like nothing is working. It seems like everything is falling apart. Until we realize that there is a power working behind the scenes that has put us in this perfect place to be the people of this shift, to be the ones who come together and actually change how life is showing up. And so I just want to leave us with this idea that we are invited to embrace the fact that every time we consciously choose something that we previously left up to the collective consciousness. So every time we make a decision where before we didn't make a decision, we are now replacing that old belief in the universal subconscious mind. We are actually healing generations and generations of unobserved, unlooked at wounds and trauma and past. Every time we choose a new thought, we are planting that new thought in the collective subconscious, not only for ourselves. And I think this is the biggest way that science of mind can change. We're not only healing that thing for ourselves, we're making that possible. We're making that thought available for literally everyone. That thought has now changed. The place where maybe the subjective mind had, my default thinking had been the decision maker in the past about something. Well, now the decision, when we replace that thought, now that decision gets to be a beneficial default thinking for someone else who doesn't realize it. We are literally changing the subjective mind. So, yes, breathe. So when we recognize that life is shouting at us from every angle, literally all the time, and that we are waking up to this idea of listening, we get to ask questions like, how am I being asked to show up differently for the good of the greater whole, not just for myself? How am I being asked to show up differently for all of us? What choices do I get to make differently for all of us? And so we then have to recognize that we are the healing arm of the world, that we become the healing of the collective to actually experience a new world, this shift that has been talked about for ever. We actually get to be the way that shift shows up. So let us all just take a nice deep breath and close our eyes and go within to that place within, the thing that we call the soul, that place within us that is never actually detached from the collective. It is that thing that understands all of this that's going on in every moment. It has never been confused. It never needs context. It is always connected to the greater whole. And it recognizes oneness and wholeness and the true perfection of the invisible forces that are behind the scenes, that are creating for us, that are creating every next step that is exactly what we need. It is this thing that has so many names, and yet none of them can actually describe all of it, all of the itness that it is. And in fact, all of the words can't aptly describe all of what it is. And yet this thing shouts at us with the most loving and intentional tone and voice and words and thoughts that are even possible. It is this warm shouting that sometimes shows up in strange ways. And yet then when we recognize them as part of the one, we recognize the perfection, the perfect way that this voice that is talking to us, this thing that comes through us, through the soul that is within, we recognize it as part of this whole. We recognize it as part of us, that we are what it is, and we are simply the outpicturing, the amplification, the echoing of this perfect thought that has been in action since the beginning, since before there even was time and space for life to exist in. There was thought, and that this thought echoes and amplifies through us to create exactly what it is that we have come to believe. And it will continue doing so. It will continue showing us exactly what it is that we believe as a collective, and it will continue showing us the world that is possible when we come together and realize that we can actually heal and change and move forward quicker. We can catch up to the speed that life is creating, and recognize that we are in fact moving forward. We are always experiencing a greater expression of the wholeness. We are always moving closer to the greatest good that is available to us. And so I recognize the deeper listening that is available to us now because of the experiences we have had. A listening that is only possible having gone through what we have all gone through together over the last however many years, whatever life has looked like, whatever perspective we've had, whatever things we thought were true. We now get to stand deeper in this principle, deeper in this listening, recognizing that life shows up in greater and greater ways in every moment. And so for this, I simply express gratitude. Gratitude to know that life is always moving forward, that life is always creating. Grateful to know that we are part of this whole, and grateful to know that there is so much more recognition of this truth now than ever before, in a greater way than ever before, in a different way than ever before. And so I simply release this gratitude in this word to law, knowing that law does what law does always, and that the most perfect outpicturing of this word, of this thought, of this changing of beliefs happens in the most perfect and divine way possible. And so it is. Thank you.
Thank you.